Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this important event on AI and climate change. My name is Ben Harris. I'm Director of the Economic Studies Program here at the Brookings Institution. So I'm so pleased that you've all chosen to join us for this event, both in person and to 1,000 RSVPs online. The topic we're here to discuss is both important and timely. Recent years have brought rapid advances in AI technologies, expanding the capabilities of AI systems to applications in a wide array of new fields. At the same time, the impact of climate change, in particular in the form of extreme weather events, remains one of our most pressing global problems. As these two trends develop in parallel, a range of new opportunities and challenges related to AI and climate change are starting to emerge. On the one hand, AI could help mitigate the climate crisis, helping researchers find cheaper alternatives to decarbonize our economy and aid assessment of exposure to climate risks. On the other hand, the increased demand for energy due to AI data centers is hindering efforts to decarbonize our energy systems. Today's event, jointly organized by Duke University and the Economic Studies Program at Brookings, will address these important topics. It is my special pleasure to welcome Dr. Toddy Steelman, Vice President and Vice Provost for Climate and Sustainability at Duke University, who will join me for a keynote fireside chat in a few minutes. Subsequently, we'll hear from 6 distinguished experts during 2 panel discussions moderated by Brian Murray, Director of the Nicholas Institute for Energy, Environment, and Sustainability at Duke University, and Sanjay Patnaik, Director of the Center on Regulation and Markets here at Brookings. The speakers on the first panel on how we can manage the energy demands of AI are Mark Florian, Managing Director, Head of BlackRock Global Infrastructure Funds, Emma Nicholson, Senior Economic Advisor at the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, and Zach Liskow, Professor of Law at Yale University. For the sake of transparency, I'd like to share that BlackRock provides generous support to the Economic Studies Program at Brookings, which helps make the work we do possible. I'd also like to reiterate Brookings' commitment to independence and underscore that the views expressed today are solely those of the speakers. The speakers on the second panel on how can AI be used to solve climate change are David Brown, who is a Snow Family Business Professor at Duke University, Helena Fu, Director of the Office of Critical and Emerging Technologies with the U.S. Department of Energy, and Himanshu Gupta, CEO and co-founder of Climate AI. The event will conclude with remarks by Ronnie Chatterjee, the Mark Burgess and Leach Benson Burgess Distinguished Professor of Business and Public Policy at Duke University, and recently appointed Chief Economist at the company OpenAI. I very much, or maybe the NGO, I don't know, NGO, thank you. So I very much look forward to the discussion today, and I'd like to welcome Toddy to the stage. Thank you.
Thank you.
So welcome.
Thank you.
So we have about 20 minutes. Is this okay? Okay. So we're just going to have a discussion. You're an expert on this. I am not. So maybe you could just start with sort of a broad assessment of your outlook for the potential impact of AI and climate change and how you see things right now.
Yeah, sure. So I think we think about the collision of 3 broad trends that are happening in this space right now. The AI revolution, the need to decarbonize the economy, and our desire to address climate change. And so if we start there, we need to think about, and this is particularly what I think about, is the role of the universities in that space, for instance. So at Duke, we're just a microcosm of what's happening in the broader society at large. So we need to increase our compute for the researchers that are on our campus, for instance, while we also adhere to what we call the Duke Climate Commitment. 2 years ago, we made a commitment to focus the attention of the entire university on climate change, and so it's a value proposition that we take very seriously. So then the question is, how do we meet the demands of compute for our research and our campus while also adhering to our desire to be carbon neutral as a campus? So that puts 2 values in tension. And the challenge for us, at least, is that we need more GPUs. Those are the graphic processing units. Those go into data centers. We need to build data centers on our campus. When you think about the design of data centers, which many people are thinking about these days, you have to think about how much energy they take, how to cool them, where you're going to locate them, how you provide renewable energy for them. And so all of those things come together on our campus. So we get to think about all of those things as a microcosm of society at large.
And is this unique to Duke, or are other universities taking on similar initiatives?
Other universities have commitments to the climate. I would say that they are similar to us like at Duke University, we have a focus on education, research, operations, community engagement, and external partnerships. So it's across our entire mission proposition. At other universities, I think we either see them leaning into the operations, how do they decarbonize their campus, or the research proposition that they have. I think we're a little bit different, and then we have a whole of university approach that we're taking, and trying to think about how you do that comprehensively across the university.
So you're thinking about this from the perspective of university leadership.
Yes.
Do you think the professors or researchers will start thinking about this from, so for example, in my house, I think about when I leave the lights on, or when my daughters, who always leave the lights on, I think about my car when I drive, but I don't think about my carbon footprint when I do a Google search.
Yeah.
So do researchers need to start thinking about their own emissions footprint when they're conducting research?
Well, there are great things about AI and there are challenges with AI, right? AI has the potential to really accelerate where and how we're doing research to improve our climate transition. But the energy that it takes to do that compute is intensive. I don't think individuals really, and we don't have really good tools for thinking about how much carbon goes into a particular run of a data set, for instance. It's not a metric that we have developed. I mean, there's a rough, it costs 10 times more energy to do OpenAI search, ChatGPT search than it does a traditional Google search, right? But when you think about running a large data set, we don't have really good metrics for what that looks like. That study is very nascent in terms of how we do that analysis. And so when you think about what that looks like across an entire campus, we don't really have good tools to think about that. And I think in general, we don't have a good business model for even thinking about what that looks like at society at large. Like, we don't know how to plow into the current costs, the externalities, whether that's carbon or biodiversity or water use that goes into a data center, into the price point on what it costs to do a search.
And so sticking with this theme around AI and research, how do you see AI transforming climate change research, maybe both the how it's done and what the focus is?
So when we think about climate research at large, the real power ends up coming from the enormous data sets that we can not only bring in, but then also combine. So if you think about what climatology can do, that's sort of the study of like hundreds of millions of years ago in terms of climate data. We can combine data sets that look at tree ring cores, corals, our oceans, tectonic plates, and bring those all together to really understand what has happened in deep time, say 500 million years ago. And when we better understand what has happened with those trends in the past, that can potentially help us predict what's happening in the future. So there's a lot we don't understand when it comes to basic climate science in these particular areas. And if we can begin to understand the past better, we can understand the future. We see this happening in some of the more recent innovations in climate science. For instance, there's been a debate in the climate science community where we need to actually understand the underlying physics in our large models before we can actually make progress to understand about what we can predict in the future. But now we can use large data sets of weather to understand what's happened in the past, and then just use pattern recognition on what we can understand to happen in the future. And so those are two competing models of how we get insight. And there are academic communities that are sort of fighting that out right now. Like, can we rely on the old data sets? Do we have to rely on physics? What is that going to look like moving forward? But they both provide us insights. And so it's just interesting to see where that scholarship is headed.
Gotcha. And so maybe to sort of dig a bit deeper on your own research, which is related to wildfire management and governance, do you see AI as an opportunity to help communities more effectively manage wildfire risk?
I think we're seeing really interesting insights when it comes in three areas: remote sensing, the use of UAVs, unmanned aerial vehicles or drones, and sensor technology. And so we see all three of those collecting enormous amounts of data. And then the opportunity comes when we can harness that data to understand better where we think wildfires may happen, how to manage the wildfires when they happen, and then what does recovery look like post-fire, so in all three phases. So for instance, we have UAVs that can help us understand hazardous fuels on the ground and where drought may be taking place as a precursor for where fires may happen. During the fire, we can understand where smoke is taking place, where the boundaries of the fire are, and how to plan evacuation better. And then post-fire, the question becomes, where are we going to see debris and what do the post-fire boundaries start to look like? So it's an opportunity using, like I said, the remote sensing, the drones, and basic sensor technology. We're also seeing the emergence of robotics. Think about sort of these robots that can go out and fight fire. And they take in also a lot of sensory data to help them operate better as well. So we're seeing really interesting cutting-edge frontiers in wildfire.
So I'm going to ask you an unfair question that requires speculation, but a lot of times when you mention AI, people immediately go straight towards the impact on the labor market. And with this, I think, sort of fear that it will displace a fair amount of labor and you'll see a lot of job loss. 10 years from now, will we still see the same level of employment with wildland firefighters?
I think that wildfire in general is tending away to having so many firefighters on the front line. So the more we can do with robotics and the more that we will do in terms of putting non-humans in harm's way, the better. So I think we will see a trend in that direction. We're also having big trouble finding enough wildland fires to actually do that work on the front lines. So robotics presents a viable alternative in terms of not just safety, but in viability of labor force.
So fewer.
Yeah.
Okay. But that's a good thing, right? We have a shortage of wildland firefighters right now. I mean, we stepped out in the DC area, I think it was a year or two ago, to all the smoke coming from Canada, which was shocking, honestly. I mean, it was like climate change and all the issues, like every breath you took. So it's maybe not necessarily bad news that one of the most dangerous professions, you'll see employment decline.
I mean, there's a lot of risk on the front line, and that's just what you get exposed to when you're in the middle of a fire. It doesn't count sort of the mental health and physical impacts post-fire that we are also seeing the wildland fire community face as well.
So moving forward with AI, there's a role for government, there's a role for universities and the research community, there's a role for the private sector. And it's my take that these roles are being defined, and we're sort of working this out as we go. But given your role in leadership at Duke on this, what do you see over the next decade or so is the specific role with universities maybe taking up some of the benefits of AI that isn't as profitable and that the private sector won't take up?
So it's a great question. Universities are not the private sector. We're not the public sector. We're not the philanthropic sector. We are the nonprofit sector, but we're not conventional nonprofit in the sense that our mission is really wide. So I think that suggests we have to lean into probably three aspects of our mission. One is convening. How do we play a role, much like this, in terms of bringing together the right stakeholders in conversation so that we can make progress in key areas that the private market will not address? Our research that we can do, and I think also in our education mission. I think it's really interesting to think about the kind of convening that we can do and where those sweet spots are, where we can bring people together that might not conventionally happen. So you think about the larger societal questions that have to do with equity, with bias. Where are we going to actually capitalize on the ability to do energy generation, transmission, and basically the energy demand and supply? How can we do a better job of bringing that together in terms of where it's needed? So these traditional collective action problems that the market doesn't really solve for, how can we as a university in partnership with other great think tanks sort of have the convening so we can think about the larger societal issues that need to be addressed?
And so you mentioned education, which was interesting. And can you elaborate on that a bit? So who needs to be educated and what do they need to be educated about?
Sure. So, I mean, at Duke, we think about this very broadly, which is we would like every student to every major should be a climate major and every career should be a climate career. Like, I defy you to find a profession where climate is not going to be affected. And then you layer on top of that the need to have literacy in a world where we're undergoing an AI revolution. So how do we think about these twin needs of climate and AI so that we can prepare the workforce of the future to be adequately prepared as we go out to deal with not only the challenges that climate change is going to present, but the revolution that AI is currently underway. That also extends to, for instance, our alumni who are already out in the workforce. How do we create reskilling opportunities for them to come back to take advantage of these sort of twin opportunities and challenges so that they are also prepared to upskill in their current jobs? So I think there are a lot of challenges, and the way you would think about climate and AI as an engineer is probably very different than the way you would think about it as someone who's in our divinity school, for instance. Yeah. So it's interesting to think about how you might grow up in a grassroots kind of way, what those skill sets are so that we can deliver well to our students both now and into the future.
Gotcha. So looking ahead, let's maybe talk, we'll end on a positive note. So maybe talking about challenges for AI. We'll get to opportunities in a second. Mm-hmm. But between AI and climate change, I mean, what are if you're going to list the top 2 or 3 biggest challenges for the interaction between AI and climate, what would you say there?
So, I mean, AI is both a blessing and a curse. I think AI, and I think you mentioned this at the outset, right? AI has the potential to really help us find solutions both in basic climate science, how we begin to mitigate the challenges of climate, how we adapt to climate. So there's a lot that AI can bring to the table in terms of increasing our knowledge, increasing our insight, increasing the wisdom that we have to deal with these incredibly challenging issues. Just because the opportunity to amass large data sets, help them bounce insight into prediction and pattern recognition is huge. But we can't ignore, and this kind of gets back to how do we ensure that we are playing the right role in society. There are lots of ethical issues associated with AI. We don't want our robot overlords taking us over. So how do we think about equity and access? And how do we think about making sure that areas that do not have access to the same areas and sectors of our economy and across the world have access to these tools in open ways? So I think there are a variety of dimensions in terms of where we have to think about not only what can AI deliver and lean into the positive aspects of it, be clear-eyed that we have to address the energy challenges that we are facing, while also thinking about those who can potentially be left behind, and the ethical aspects of being transparent, open, and ensuring that we have good representation in our data sets and those algorithms.
And to try to size the energy challenges. So if you look at reports coming out of McKinsey and others, I think they're showing roughly 3% of today's grid goes towards processing of data and data centers. And by 2030, not that far off, it's going to be more like 6, 7, 8%. Mm-hmm. Does that feel like a reasonable size estimate to you?
I think there are some pretty good confidence intervals around those bounds, that, smaller to larger. I think we know it's going to have a huge impact. What's interesting is that we've been through transitions before when we've seen large increases in compute and energy demands from data centers in the past. Those level off over time because we get more efficient in both our hardware and our software. But we are still on a very steep climb in terms of where we are right now with the increase in energy demand. And I think that it's paying attention, to those demand curves for energy right now. And then what can we do to build more efficient data centers, co-locate those data centers in ways where we can use the heat from those data centers, improve the hardware that goes into the data centers for greater efficiency, and also the software that goes into the compute associated with the hardware as well. So there are many places where we can build on efficiencies at every stage in the process, and it's going to be really important that we're intentional, about that moving forward, given the increases in energy demand we're going to face.
And do you think there's enough resources at universities being devoted to these questions around efficiency, around the hardware and software?
Well, we have to build our own data centers So we are working on these issues in real time. And the way we're wrestling with them, at least right now, is that we know that we have to deliver for our own researchers and do the same thing, co-location, find renewable resources, figure out what the cooling is going to be, how are we going to reuse our water, what kind of renewable energy can we use. But we also know that we can't do it in isolation. We also have to have regional solutions. So like Duke wants to work collaboratively with NC State and UNC and A&T and NC Central in our region so that we're servicing a larger sector and not just thinking about these one-off solutions at each campus. So we have to really think more collaboratively about how we're going to do this so we can serve at scale and in ways that are more efficient.
Okay, so let's end on a positive note. AI can play a major role, it's my understanding, in addressing concerns around climate change. If you're going to list the 2 or 3 biggest opportunities, the things that make you most hopeful here, what would they be?
So I think we have huge opportunities on climate science, basic climate science, and how we will improve the large integrated computer modeling models that we have for climate. I think that's going to get better over time. So we understand the Earth systems better. I think that when it comes to mitigation, we're going to see real gains in terms of how we use energy more efficiently across our entire energy system. So imagine utilities use AI to get smarter about how they switch between renewable energies and how they switch between conventional energy to manage their loads, balance their loads. And then I think also we can get a lot smarter when it comes to adaptation, especially when we think about models that help us, agent modeling systems, where we can put simulated humans together with natural data sets and understand what the consequences are for policy changes. So imagine we want to understand how carbon markets work more effectively. We can do that on much larger scales as well. So I think there's opportunity to understand how we can refine policy in agent modeling systems.
I see. Okay, so sounds like you're generally optimistic. You've acknowledged some of the challenges, but overall, is it your main takeaway that this is more of a blessing than a curse when it comes to climate change?
I think that we have a real opportunity right now to get ahead of this, especially when it comes to the energy piece.
I see.
And we're seeing a really interesting dialogue, not only nationally but internationally, about how to engage in providing energy for these large data centers. And if we can get that right, there is a way for these hyperscalers, the Microsofts, the Googles, the Alibabas, to really drive change in a highly productive way. They can create the demand for the next generation of renewable energy systems, whether that's nuclear or hydrogen or other, to get them over the hump, just like they did with wind and solar, if we're clever about it. So I'm a glass half full type of gal. So, that's where I would leave it.
That's a great way to leave it. Everyone, please join me in thanking Dr. Steelman for this great conversation. Thank you.
Thank you.
I think we'll welcome the next panel to the stage.
I'm supposed to sit in the middle.
Oh, yeah, I think. Thanks. There's a little card
There
for
we
us.
go. Fantastic. Hello, everyone. Do we have our friends on Zoom? That we do. Okay, you will see them shortly. I am Brian Murray. I'm the director of the Nicholas Institute for Energy, Environment, and Sustainability at Duke. And I'm really pleased to moderate this panel on how to tackle the energy demands of AI. We've heard a lot about the potential benefits of AI. This is not the session to bring you down, but basically to make you realize sort of the scale and the scope of the challenge. Couldn't be a more timely topic. At the risk of dating myself a little bit, back in the late 1980s when I was looking into PhD programs, I was being recruited by one university to work on the artificial intelligence of forest management. And I remember thinking at that time, boy, that sounds like a fad. So maybe I'll just kind of skip that. So don't ask me for any predictions on what's going to happen 40 years down the road because my track record is not so great. But I mean, it's really actually for a while it was sort of back and, until it really AI really kind of reinvented itself to be what it is right now with machine learning and the advanced methods that it has. So what AI and data centers have done is they've pushed us from this world, at least in the United States, and really more globally, but I'll start with the United States, of a flat load growth world. For the 21st century, the demand for electricity has been relatively flat after growing throughout the entire 20th century. And that was what we were all projecting. You know, the Energy Information Administration is all projecting that was just going to continue on, flat load growth. And then boom. Data centers start taking off, AI starts taking off. There's data center power demands are expected to rise up to about 160% just this decade. The stat that was alluded to in the opening. And in the US, that would take us from about 3% to 9% of total demand. And not all of it is driven by AI. Let's keep that in mind. There's a lot of reasons for bringing data together. AI is one of them, but about a quarter to a third of that load growth is attributable to AI. So that's going to require billions in new investment, at least $50 billion in new investment just to meet the AI load growth. And then it's going to put stresses on water and greenhouse gases. The Nicholas Institute just released a report a couple weeks ago for the COP climate meetings in Azerbaijan that looked at this from the U.S. perspective. What is load growth looking like? So not just data centers, but also reshoring of manufacturing in the United States and electrification of households and transportation. What does that mean for the power sector? What the generation mix would look like? What the emissions will look like? And we've estimated that so we looked at a couple of things. We looked at, can we actually have renewable energy grow at the pace that it needs to grow in order to temper emissions, or are we going to be bound by permitting constraints? And we found that at minimum, there's likely to be a 25 to 30% increase in emissions above what would be business as usual in 2035 as a result of this new load growth. That'll still be lower emissions than we have today and a lot lower than in 2005, but not as low as we were on the trajectory to go. So that's something to keep in mind. I put a copy of the QR code for the report out on the front desk, and I welcome you to read that and get back in touch with me. But we have a great panel to discuss these challenges. Before I introduce the panel and start with the questions, I'm told there are index cards that are or can be circulated throughout the room. So if you have any questions for the panel, please use those index cards, and somebody from Brookings will bring them forward, and I'll sort through them and try to ask some questions at the end. So as was introduced earlier, our panel is Mark Florian, who's the Managing Director, Head of BlackRock Global Infrastructure Funds, Emma Nicholson, who's a Senior Economic Advisor from Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, or FERC, and Zachary Liskow, who's Professor of Law at Yale Law School. So thank you, Mark and Zachary, for joining us remotely. So I'm just going to start with a general question to all of you, which is, from your perspective, what are some of the biggest challenges in expanding energy supply to meet the rising demands of AI? And since you're sitting right next to me, I'll go with you, and then we'll move on to the others.
Sure. Thank you very much, and I'm looking forward to reading that report. I can say I've worked in the energy space for about 20 years, and nothing has come on the scene faster than this new load growth from AI and data centers and computing loads. So it's certainly introduced, I think there's already a challenge that the energy industry was facing, and they called it the trilemma, if y'all are on the conference circuit, which is sustainable, affordable, and reliable energy. And now we have this new, very quick, fast-appearing load growth that I think we're still grappling with how to manage. And I think one of the biggest challenges, just from my point of view, and not one my agency has to face for the most part, I think is siting. It is really hard to build things in the United States, both transmission, generation. So I think that we'll have to do a lot of streamlining of permitting, and there's also that conflict with a strong desire, which is a very good one, to incorporate more stakeholders into siting and permitting processes. So I can imagine that'll be a difficult challenge to make. But I think siting is going to be challenging, and then funding the the investments that are going to be required to meet these loads is also going to be a challenge. There are deep pockets in tech, so hopefully everyone's expecting they'll pay their fair share. But
Can you say a little bit more about the permitting challenges and kind of what lies behind them? We don't have too much time to go too deep in that, but
yeah. Well, first, I forgot to add my caveat. Excuse me. I'm Emma Nicholson from FERC, but I only speak for myself. I don't speak for my agency, my commissioner, my chairman or commissioners or staff. So if I say anything that annoys you, don't worry about it because I don't have a vote. I'm not a commissioner who actually has a vote. We just advise them on what to do. So I apologize. I should have said that first. But I think in terms of siting and permitting, one note is FERC does not cite any electric generation, so it actually would fall to the states. And we also only have backstop siting authority for transmission. A lot of the siting challenges are going to be faced at the state and local level. And it is, I think, there's that inherent tension of trying to bring community involved and consider things like environmental justice and other aspects that you would want to do to bring the community along and in their development, while also this driving need to build things yesterday. It just takes an incredibly long time. I wish I had solutions. I do energy wholesale electricity markets, so I'm going to leave that to greater minds to expedite that.
maybe we can loop back a little bit later and talk about regional transmission planning and the order out in front of FERC right now. So, Mark Florian, what are some of the big challenges you see out there from your perspective in the investment community?
Hi, Brian. Hi, everybody. Thanks for having me on the panel today. Just to give some context, we invest in power systems we have for many, many years, both renewable and going way back, conventional. And we also invest in data centers, in fiber systems, as well as mobile telephone towers, all integral to the future we're talking about. Obviously, as you've highlighted, Brian, and Toddy and Ben talked about, there's a huge growth curve that 2 to 3 times the number of data centers, for example, in the U.S. By 2030 than we have today. That's alone in the U.S. is about $500 billion of expenditure to build all the data centers that would be necessary. And interestingly, that's not all AI. There's still a lot of growth in cloud computing and the need for cloud. We're just voracious demanders of data, and the amount of data we consume as a global society is expected to double by 2030. So that alone is driving it, and that's cloud plus AI as a new driver. So that all needs a lot more power, and there's a couple of challenges with that, and Emma named a few of these, which I think are really key. First is, how do you find the land? How do you get permits on a local and federal basis to execute on building power plants? How do you get grid connectivity or connectivity to the data center campuses that need to be built? On top of just the logistics, it typically takes, Emma might have a slightly different number, but 3 to 7 years to plan to execute on building a new power plant of scale. So on top of that, a lot of the major hyperscalers, the big users of data centers, Microsoft, Amazon, Google, Meta, they've made clean energy pledges, which are terrific, and it's the way it should be. But the challenge with that is that most clean energy as we see it today is intermittent in nature. Wind and solar work when the sun is shining and the wind is blowing, but it doesn't otherwise. We can work on energy storage systems to try to smooth out that intermittency. But data centers need energy 24/7, every second of every day. And actually, the amount of consumption inside a data center can be really volatile, but it needs 100% of the capacity every second of every day. Otherwise, internet AI won't work as we all want it to. So I see that as a big challenge, is the intermittency of a lot of what we have in terms of clean energy supply today, when we have a use case that needs energy every second of every day. And then the other thing I would just mention, which we're already seeing in different parts of the world, is this increase in demand for energy and the perception or the concern that it may squeeze out other parts of the populace that uses energy and might increase pricing of energy or create potential shortages of energy in different parts of the world. And we've already seen in Dublin, as well as in Singapore, that governmental entities are starting to put caps on the amount of new data centers that can be built because of the concern of access to power. So a lot of things in terms of getting it all built, financing it, as Emma mentioned, the need for clean energy, but it's intermittent, and then ultimately public policy issues that will be faced in the jurisdictions where a lot of data centers are concentrated. All those are big challenges. I look forward to talking about some solutions, but I'll stop there.
So Mark, a lot of people do think of the hyperscalers as sort of almost coming to the rescue in that they have a sort of willingness to pay above market price, I think, for the power in order to meet their commitments. What's your sense for how long that ride can last?
I think it's really core to some of the companies I mentioned to drive the growth in data center capacity and capacity for AI specifically. And so we see a great willingness. We're in contact and talking to all these players. There's a great willingness to put hundreds of billions of dollars in commitments behind building these data centers. But I think the commitments are there. It is a relatively concentrated number of companies that are willing to put that capital at risk to build out this capacity. But I think it very much is there, just given the growth in these markets and how these companies are trying to satisfy that growth.
Thanks, Mark. Now, Zachary, to you, give us some of your thoughts on sort of the big challenges associated with meeting the demand needs.
Yeah, thanks so much for the invitation to be here today, and sorry to not be able to be there in person. So I think, echoing what others have said, I think the biggest challenge is increasing our supply of electricity in a way that's as inexpensive and as environmentally friendly as possible, especially given concerns about climate change. So to do that, unless there's some major breakthrough that I wouldn't count on, we're going to need to build a lot of renewable energy. To use renewable energy, we have to do two things. We need to generate it, then we need to transmit it, often across long distances. So let me take those one by one. So first, to generate it, I think that there are two big challenges within generation. First, we need to deal with the siting issues that are, if anything, becoming harder over time. Localities are increasingly banning the placement of renewables in their jurisdictions. We can talk about solutions, but I think New York and Massachusetts are leading the way here. Basically, we need states to preempt state and local governments from banning these things. We also really do not want the IRA to be repealed, since those subsidies are important for the generation of renewables. So that's the first thing. We need to generate the renewables, electricity. Then we need to transmit it. And I think that what a lot of people have in mind with transmission is kind of short distance transmission, but often what we need is transmission across many states, because renewable energy is often really far from population centers. And for that, we need high capacity, long distance transmission of the kind that we essentially have not built any of for a decade. So we need a major change here, or else we'll basically be unable to make the green transition that we need to provide the electricity to the AI data centers, et cetera. So for transmission, I think there are three main challenges. First is siting. Here, I think Congress needs to step in. FERC needs to basically preempt state and local governments. These transmission lines need to go across many states. Very hard to coordinate a bunch of states and localities. So FERC needs to be able to step in and site it. That's actually not enough. Major challenge are the incentives of local monopolist utilities who often do not want competition from out of state from cheap renewable energy. So their incentives need to be changed. Something that FERC, we have an expert here, but I believe FERC can do as part of that on its own. And then finally, we need to deal with issues of national permitting. So this is the National Environmental Policy Act. Once we actually do begin to be able to build these long distance transmission lines, permitting at the federal level is likely to hold them up for several years. We need to change that, and we can talk about how to deal with NEPA. But in short, we need to generate it, we need to transmit it. I think there are a host of policy issues that we can work on to improve things here dramatically.
So let's pull the permitting thread a little bit more, if that's okay. So what are some of the ideas that you have, Zachary, for how policymakers can help expedite the permitting process? I know you've said it needs to be done, authorities, incentives need to be aligned, but can you dig just a little bit deeper and tell us what some of the specific examples would be of policy reform? And then I'll ask you to respond, and then I'll get back to Mark on something else in a bit.
Yeah. So there are many different pieces of permitting. I think when people think permitting, they often think the National Environmental Policy Act. That's really, with respect to electricity transmission and generation, that's really just a piece of it, not even the majority of it. So let me talk about a couple different permitting pieces. The first is this FERC preemption part. So right now, to build your line across a bunch of states and a bunch of cities, you might have to get like 50 different permits from each of the cities, each of the states, and you have to get all of them to build your line from one place to another, and that's just like wildly impractical. And like we're never going to build these things. And in fact, this is a lot of why we have built zero of them, these long distance lines for a decade. So we need basically a national actor to step in. FERC is a natural one. Some also think that Department of Energy could possibly step in, but I think the most natural one, and the one where the proposals in Congress to do so, would be for FERC to have more than the backstop authority that Emma mentioned before, but rather be the entity that can permit it. The second piece, with respect to permitting and especially transmission at the national level, is the National Environmental Policy Act. So what happens here is for anything that goes over federal land or with federal funding or involving federal agency action, there needs to be an environmental review. And that environmental review across all environmental impact statements today takes over 4 years. And then often it's litigated, often for a couple of years. Even when the lawsuit fails, it takes a couple of years. So you had together 4 years to write the environmental review, 2 years to litigate it. That's way, way, way too long if you want to make the green transition, anytime soon. So we can talk more about the specific things, but there are some ideas that folks have talked about to speed things up from just most basically capacity building, having more bodies to actually permit it, to second, to the kind of the tougher side, which is having more involvement, but also by the public, but also making it a little harder to sue.
Yeah, I think, at the crux of this is, people don't make permitting hard because they just like to make permitting hard. It kind of harkens to a colleague of mine, Jim Salzman, and a colleague of his wrote a paper a couple of years ago in a law journal called The Green's Dilemma, when the new Green Deal meets the old green laws. And so these are all put in place for really good reasons for environmental and community protection. So Emma, maybe talk us through that. What are some of the challenges associated with, how can you make permitting reform work while still honoring the environmental protections and the community protections that are intended to be there?
I wish I could tell you. I think it's a challenge that certainly we're going to have to face as a nation, but it is certainly one thing is true is we're going to have to figure it out to meet these loads, and it is depressingly and exceptionally difficult to build anything anywhere, or just bananas, the acronym I'm sure we're all familiar with. I'm not a permitting expert. I don't do that in my day-to-day job. I would just note we mostly permit, actually exclusively, at FERC, natural gas pipeline infrastructure interstate under the Natural Gas Act. In the Electricity Act, the only permitting authority we have for transmission is in the event of that the Department of Energy designates sort of a national interest corridor of transmission, and that's, you can imagine how long it'll take to get to us. And then we've never, ever cited electricity transmission infrastructure at FERC, so it would certainly, something like that would take some time, and I can't offer any expertise on how to efficiently do that, but just to note that capable siting and legal people will have to have some challenges ahead to do that more efficiently.
All right, so permitting TBD, but it's sort of clearly a key issue. Mark, back to you. BlackRock Global Infrastructure Fund's portfolio covers a lot of different areas. Are there any regions where the private sector has been particularly successful in managing energy costs for AI applications? So what kind of lessons can we learn from those examples?
I do think we've gotten to this point over the last 15 years. We've built a huge data center fleet, and it's generally worked pretty well. And it's been a matter of trying to find the capacity for power as well as the siting and everything else you need to make a data center work. And Northern Virginia is a great example of that, where the state and local governments generally have had a favorable approach to data center siting and building. The local utility has been focused on creating growth in power availability and in clean power as well. And then you have the major players in data centers, users of data centers, as I mentioned earlier, Microsoft, Amazon, Google, Meta, and others that are willing to write long-term commitments to support the construction. So if you have all those things coming together, you could potentially have a lot of growth, and Northern Virginia is the largest data center market in the world. Some estimate as much as 70% of all the internet searches touch the Northern Virginia data center market, which is pretty extraordinary if you think about it. So I think there are examples of that around the world. I also think collaboration amongst the various key parties to execute on data center development and execution is really, really important. I'll give you one example. In Frankfurt, which is one of the key data center markets in Europe, there's a local utility that provides power. It set up a subsidiary to focus on the development of data centers because it knew that this was going to be key for the region. And the beauty of that, and then they ultimately brought in private capital to help finance the growth of that data center development company that was a subsidiary of this power utility. Why does that make sense? Well, the power utility had expertise in procuring power, it owned land, it owned interconnection rights, and it knew how to permit projects in its local region. At the same time, they didn't have enough capital within the utility to develop this, and so private capital came in a public-private partnership of sorts to help drive the overall business plan. So if you can have collaboration by the key parties, and oh, by the way, some of the major hyperscalers I mentioned earlier are contracting a lot of those data centers. U.S. companies contracting in Frankfurt for capacity in Europe. So I think collaboration around all the key parties here can really make things happen, as challenging as it is.
So, Mark, I'm going to go back to you and ask about the role that private equity can play in all this, and you could maybe tease that out a little bit. What role can they play in financing sustainable energy solutions in this space?
Yeah, I mean, the public markets have continued to grow, but it's interesting because the private markets have grown faster overall. And there's a couple of examples of that. For example, commercial bank lending has grown, but there's been actually a much faster growth in private credit through private equity types of firms that are, in some cases, disintermediating the bank market and creating further capacity and growth. So I think you'll already see that there's huge amounts of investment from private equity, infrastructure funds, private credit funds in the data center market and just in energy infrastructure overall primarily power. And literally, hundreds of billions of dollars has already been deployed between those sources of capital, and it will be an important source of capital along with the public markets to fund this huge need that we all have.
Great, thanks. Zachary, I'm going to go back to you and ask you about how should policymakers be thinking about balancing investments in new infrastructure to meet the energy demands versus upgrades to existing infrastructure? A lot of the permitting, not all, but many of the permitting concerns we've talked about to date are lessened considerably if you're not building brand new greenfield infrastructure. So can you speak a little bit to that?
Yeah. So it would be great from a permitting perspective, from a siting perspective, if we could reuse the sites that are already used. Then you don't have to engage in a new battle about where to put stuff, since there's already something there. And there's a decent amount of bandwidth to do this. You can do something called reconductoring or transmission to go from place A to place B. You put the old wire, replace the old wires with new wires, and be like double capacity. And that's really great to be able to do that. But there are limits, and that's an important thing that you can do. But there are going to be a lot of limits. Limit number one: we're going to need a lot more electricity, and we're going to have to generate it. And that generation is going to require new siting. Those sites are often going to be far from Northern Virginia, where the data centers are. That's going to require transmission lines in places that are not where they currently are. So we're going to need to build new transmission. So we're going to need to build new generation. We're going to need to build new transmission. We can try to keep the old nuclear plants going for a time, but ultimately, just a lot more demand, and so there are limits. So all in favor of reusing what we have where it's cost effective, but ultimately, when we come to policy decisions, we're going to need to recognize that we have statutes on the books that are really old, and that the world has changed quite a lot since they were written. And I'm talking here about the National Environmental Policy Act. I'm talking here about the legislation authorizing FERC. Fact is, we now have energy that needs to be generated really far from where it's consumed, which is really different from having the nuclear plants and the natural gas plants and the coal plants pretty close to where they're used. And then second, we have climate change. So you put the stuff that's really far away from where it needs to be used, and climate change, and it means we often need a big rethinking of how we do things from a policy perspective. And in particular, because often the thing that's more pro-environment now is building rather than not building. Because of climate change, all the more reason to rethink things on the ground.
Thanks. So I'm going to, as you point out, FERC really has fairly limited control on things like regulating where electricity is built and where it can be transmitted, but do have some regulatory authority over wholesale energy and ancillary services markets. So can you talk a little bit about how are those markets responding to the growing demand for energy brought on by AI and other sources?
Sure. Yeah, and that's correct. We can't direct the Federal Power Act, which is the enabling legislation statute that FERC works under. We can't direct generation or cite it, but we regulate a construct you're probably all familiar with, the wholesale electricity market. We regulate 6 of the 7 wholesale electricity markets in the United States, and all of them have energy and ancillary service markets, and 3 of them have a capacity market. And capacity market, because we were talking about, we need to build new stuff. That's a really important feature in how to fund new generation capacity in markets that have them. There's a map. If you go to FERC webpage, you can Google, or just Google RTOs ISOs, you'll see like a map of the U.S. and a couple color blobs. Only part of the country where most of the load happens to be are served by wholesale electricity markets that we regulate directly. Outside of those markets, they're a traditionally regulated system, and data centers are appearing in both RTO and non-RTO areas. And there's within the RTO area, the wholesale electricity markets, capacity markets are designed to send investment signals to power plants to either build, retire, or delay retirement based on a projection of projected load need. They're typically either 1 year or 3 years forward. So that's one big signal that we're counting on to drive investment in new capacity. Again, as you noted, we've had a pretty flat load curve now, and now it's increased. In addition to, I don't really want to depress everybody, but in addition to challenges in siting and permitting new facilities, there's also a challenge in interconnecting them to the grid, and there's a very exciting interconnection queue issue, which we can table, but that's another issue we have to resolve to quickly build stuff. So the capacity markets within the ISOs are a driver, and also outside the ISOs, there's actually some really innovative deals that large data centers, big tech are developing with their local utility to be included in their integrated planning process, which is how they build capacity to serve their loads like Southern Company, NV Energy, Duke, and also the tech companies themselves, as I'm sure we're all aware, outside of the capacity construct and the working directly with the utility, are funding their own infrastructure like SMRs and other TMI. Constellation is working with Microsoft to reopen and relicense 3 Mile Island. Also, the Palisades plant in Michigan is going to be reopened. So there's a lot of creative ways people are trying to work together, both within the capacity market construct, the integrated planning construct, and the direct purchase power agreements that are being used to fund some of this new infrastructure. Generation capacity, excuse me. Yeah.
We have some great questions from the audience. I'm going to hit one of them right now. Sort of a combination of two of the questions. So are free-to-use AI tools part of the problem, right? So should we just be focusing on expanding supply to meet this seemingly endless demand, or should we be doing some things on the demand side? And as part of another question, have consumers ceded the energy decisions to the hyperscalers? So there's no assigned respondent to this, but if anybody wants to jump in on this, please do so.
I can jump in. I think, yes, I think it's horrifying that like I could just sort of like have them make a video of my dog or like a video about bananas or some kind of nonsense, right? And then I have no bearing or consequences for my decision, not even like a visual of what I'm doing. So and whenever I see those like fan graphs and projections of data center loads, I kind of hope and pray, well, that assumes like today's kind of resource-free seemingly to the end user use of this stuff. So one could only hope if you price it more appropriately and we actually start hitting capacity constraints, it'll be used more judiciously. And as our first professor said, when we can expect greater efficiencies in computing and a combination of both, better computing, better algorithms, more efficient machines, better cooling, all of that could hopefully sort of tamper down the upper end of those load curves. But of course, then you add electrification and onshoring. Who knows where we'll end up? But I would hope that there would be something to moderate that, because it seems a little bit unsustainable today.
Yeah, what's kind of interesting, I mean, Toddy mentioned earlier that an AI-aided search takes 10 times as much energy as a simple Google search. Is there such thing as a simple Google search anymore? Because now, and this is like the last few weeks, like every time I go to Google, 2/3 of the time it comes back with an AI overview to the question that I'm asking it. So I've even lost my ability to say, no, maybe I don't want AI to go there. Google goes and does it. So that's sort of an interesting development there. Zachary or Mark, any thoughts on this?
Yeah. Listen, I'm an economist, so the economics, doesn't always have the right perspective, but it's a decent baseline often, and I think it is here. So from the perspective of economics, the way to do this is to have the price reflect the cost of production and the externalities to the world from global climate change and other impacts on the environment. And then, the private sector and individuals will have their preferences and act accordingly. So currently, we do not have the right price for electricity because we do not have a carbon price. And I do not think we will have one anytime soon. So it's important to, for policy actors to, to do what they can in the absence of that, both to, to kind of compensate for the fact that we don't have a carbon price, one, and two, to remove the regulatory barriers that are making it harder to build clean energy, which have the effects of both, those barriers both increase prices and increase greenhouse gas emissions. So that's a double whammy. So the way I look at this is basically the lever that we have is policy. We're not going to have a carbon price anytime soon. So what we can do is remove the barriers to building clean energy, and those are the things I described before. Make permitting easier through revisions to the National Environmental Policy Act, giving FERC more authority to permit across many states and jurisdictions, and change the incentives of the utilities companies so that they want the cheap energy from out of state, and not so that they do not want that competition.
Mm-hmm. Mark, any thoughts on this?
Yeah, no, I do think it's a challenge. I think Zachary said it right, is that we don't have pricing that reflects the amount of compute use and therefore the power use. And I think of our family. We have the friends and family plan with AT&T, and we pay for unlimited volume of use of mobile. And mobile, by the way, is the fastest growing and ultimately the biggest use of data. So that's a great example where we're not really being asked to pay for our volumetric use of both power and compute power. I do have a couple of other ideas, though, I think that hopefully will be solutions that we can lean into the future. One is just lowering the amount of electricity we need for compute. And so ultimately, I think technology should be a solution here where we can have greater compute per unit of electricity or power consumption. And that I think has to be part of the solution here. And how you execute on it. I think the technology companies, the NVIDIAs of the world, will be focused on this as part of their design of future chips and chipsets. Also, there's a lot of work going on with regard to cooling in data centers. Is about 1.3, 1.4 times the amount of electricity used for compute in a data center is actually used for heating, ventilating, air conditioning, and other ancillary uses. And so HVAC really matters. And so there's a lot of work going on and around more efficient cooling, which will reduce energy consumption. And then I think we need new sources of power. And we've already referenced small-scale modular reactors for nuclear could be a great source. A lot of the big players, technology players, are now starting to put some capital behind the development of new technologies, such as SMRs. And government can play a big role in that too, and already is, in terms of providing loans or other means of trying to develop those types of clean energy technologies faster. That's not coming probably till the 2030s, but nonetheless, we're going to need it, given all the growth here. The last thing that just strikes me in this whole conversation is the more compute power we have available, particularly if we're not being asked to pay for every unit of compute power we're using, the more we're going to find ways to use it. And I know a lot of you may have been in San Francisco or LA and seen Waymos running around, driverless cars that are taxis. I've been in one. I think they're pretty cool. But the amount of compute power it takes just to have one driverless car, constantly analyzing everything that's around it, as well as thinking about how it interacts in the overall vehicular system is just immense. So we're going to find more ways to consume compute. So we have to find ways to limit the amount of power use and have cleaner sources that are 24/7 available.
Yeah, so a couple things there. Just we haven't talked much, and I don't suggest that we do, but like in terms of quantum computing and how that could actually improve the efficiencies of data centers and AI. But the cooling problem with quantum is even more severe than it is with regular computing. So something to think about. But several people in the Q&A in the audience did pick up on nuclear as an issue. One person says very small, extremely safe nuclear reactors have been used in nuclear submarines for 70 plus years. Why can't we do more of this? As many of you know, Microsoft just struck a deal with Constellation Energy to reopen the closed part of 3 Mile Island nuclear plant, not the one closed in '79, the one that closed just a few years ago. And then small modular reactors, this may be where the hyperscalers, quote unquote, come to the rescue, as we talked earlier about that. So do you want to, we'll start with you, Emma, and then the rest will take it, and then we're be pretty close to done after that.
I think that's certainly true, and that's a nice silver lining is I've been working in energy for over 20 years, and SMRs have been around the corner for the whole time, so we're really great to see that hit the market, and reopening some nukes that have recently retired. I've read, I don't know for sure, but NRC, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, they're probably going to need to staff up because there's going to be there's a human capital shortage, I think, in civilian nuclear energy in this country, that in order to support that growth that the big tech is funding, we'll probably have to rebuild that capacity just so we can operate it and safely operate it.
Anything else on nuclear, Zachary? I know Mark alluded to it a little bit earlier.
Yeah, I'll just say, I hope it works out. It'd be really great if in the 2030s we have a bunch of SMRs that can, fund all of, they can provide all of our electricity. It's uncertain. Might work, might not work. We shouldn't count on it. If we counted on it and didn't build out the clean energy, then we're going to be stuck. But using fossil fuels into the 2030s, so I think we shouldn't count on it. Opening up these nukes. I grew up 5 miles away from Palisades, Michigan, and rural Michigan, and it's costing billions of dollars to restart that thing. So that's not a super economical solution. Although I'm glad that we're doing it because it's clean energy and I guess also provides some jobs in the target area of the country. But hope it works out. But it just shouldn't count on it. So I think these other things, not 100% sure that we need to do all these things because maybe we'll have super clean SMRs in several years, but wouldn't count on it. Climate's too important.
Okay, well, and then we'll talk about fusion next year when we talk about quantum. But we have about a minute left right now, so I was going to ask each of you if you could just give sort of a quick summary, take-home messages that you want to leave the audience with about key concerns or messages on this topic. So Emma?
It'll take a village. I think this challenge will bring multiple disciplines to bear. But I believe in American ingenuity, and the grid has never held us back from developing before. We'll have to make some changes, do some things we're uncomfortable with, but I think we're up to the challenge.
Optimistic message, Mark.
Sorry. I think it is a huge challenge, and the only way we can deal with the challenge is find new ways to provide either energy efficiency or cleaner supply. And the existing systems are great, but to meet this challenge, I think we need something new. And so, like I was saying, we have to figure out ways to lower the consumption of either the HVAC around compute or the compute itself. And then we have to find newer sources of energy that is not carbon intensive. And right now, small-scale modular reactors seem to be it, but there are some challenges. These companies are relatively young, and some of them had stubbed their toe on the way to getting to commercial production. But I do think in the 2030s, we're going to see the installation of some of these, and hopefully, like Zachary says, hopefully it works and works well. We're going to need it.
Well, the mute music is coming on in the background, so Zachary, real quick, any key messages for the audience here?
Yeah, two things. First, while really hope that we should do as much as we can to increase efficiency, I think ultimately, reflecting what Mark said, I think we want an abundance mindset here. We need to produce production. We need to increase production of electricity, especially clean electricity in a way that does not harm the environment, rather actually improves the environment, reduces our greenhouse gas emission, not increases it. Second, because it's good for the economy, good for the environment. Second, I think with respect to policy, we really need to rethink older orthodoxies. When our environmental laws were passed in circa 1970, like the way to help the environment was to not build, stop building the highway, et cetera. Now we've inverted that. Now it's often the case that to build, to help the environment, we need to build. So often the pro-environment thing now is going to be to build. That's going to require change in the laws, change judicial doctrine, and it's going to be a challenge for those of us who care a huge amount about the environment to get there.
So new pathways will require new thinking and new policies. I think that's the summary point right there. So if you all will please join me in thanking our panel for a provocative session.
Let's move around.
She's there. All right, everyone. Do we have our virtual participant online? See? Perfect. Hey, Manju. All right. I think after the panel of lots and lots of challenges that we see, I'm going to try to end the workshop today with the opportunities panel, with a positive message. Because as we all know, AI has tremendous potential to improve our lives in many different ways. And I think climate is one of those. And there's a lot of potential to really find new solutions for climate change with AI. And so we have three amazing panelists here today. We have Himanshu Gupta from Climate AI on the panel here virtually. We have David Brown from Duke University and Helena Fu from the DOE. So I want to start off with a general question to all three of you. When you look at kind of like the perspective on AI and the intersection of AI and climate, what do you see some of the biggest challenges in our fight against climate change where AI could really have a big impact? Why don't we start with you, Himanshu?
Thanks, Sanjay. It's great to be here. And apologies for missing out being there in person. I just came back from Japan like a few hours ago. So as you talked about the challenges and opportunities, we think of AI as a time and effectiveness multiplier to the solutions of climate change. So think about the light bulb on top of your head right now. And I don't know whether I can hear the audience or not, but can anyone guess what would light bulb have anything to do with the AI and climate conversation we are having here?
No? No takers.
No worries. So, in early 1900s, when Edison and his co-inventors were working on commercializing light bulb, it took them almost 3.5 to 4 years to perfect the filament of a light. In fact, what they were trying to do is figure out a filament material that can withstand temperatures up to thousands of degrees for at least 9 or 10 months to be able to commercialize a light bulb. And they took them literally thousands of experiments with various materials until they zeroed down on bamboo filament back then. But imagine now with the simulation techniques that we have, it would have taken them basically minutes to figure out the same material. And back then, light bulb was considered a clean technology, believe it or not. because it was an alternate to kerosene lamps or whale oil based lamps. So for us, that's an example of how AI can help accelerate the solutions of climate change. And to the point, the challenges are also linked to the solutions of climate change, where we are running out of time, we are running out of money as well. In pharma, there was close to, in pharmaceuticals, they invest 21% of their annual revenue into R&D. If you look at climate tech, with $1.3 trillion of losses happening every year, just insured and uninsured combined, the funding that goes into climate tech is still $30 to $40 billion, less than 2 or 3%. So how do we get more out of every dollar spent to find solutions? And where funding is a challenge, and that's where AI can also come in.
Great, wonderful. David, how about you? Where do you see kind of like the biggest potential for AI to have an impact?
Yeah, so I think there's a lot of directions you could take this question. I think if I were to point at one thing, I would point at climate modeling in the longer term, thinking about the challenges we have with the physics-based models. The spatiotemporal resolution, they're computationally very, very demanding. And so I think with AI-based models, you can circumvent a lot of that computational difficulty and think about local planning at the municipality level, neighborhood level, maybe even household level, thinking about adaptation planning and resilience planning. I think AI can be a game changer for that. So that's kind of what I would think about. Again, lots of other kind of more detailed things we could talk about. We'll unpack some of that in some of our questions here, but that's kind of what I would point to. Yeah.
Awesome. How about you, Helena?
I mean, there's I think, a really exciting horizon on what is possible, right? Whether it's AI for scientific discovery, materials discovery, which will have so many different implications in the energy sector, climate, weather modeling. I think AI on the grid is one where we're going to need to see some innovation. Currently seeing a lot of AI on the sort of outside of the perimeter applications, but I think kind of looking forward, how do you get all these different disparate sources of energy onto the grid in a timely manner, in a way that is flexible and is able to kind of address intermittency and other kinds of challenges that currently exist.
So let me stay on kind of like your work at the DOE. How does AI fit in the greater mission of the DOE?
Yeah, and
it's not the first place we would think about AI applications, but I'm curious to see how you and your team and your colleagues see that.
Yeah, and in fact, just reflecting on some of the earlier panels, we are investing a lot in AI already. Many of you may or may not know this, but DOE is actually the steward of 3 of the fastest supercomputers in the world. In fact, as of 2 weeks ago, the top 3 at 3 of our national labs, 2 of which are open to the scientific community. I think what is not often known about DOE is that we steward scientific infrastructure for the country. So this is not just pure energy. This is, the most powerful X-rays, genomic centers, nanoscience centers. And this kind of infrastructure creates an enormous amount of data, right? And I think we can all agree that large language models, general purpose models now are extremely useful for our everyday lives. But I think what we are excited about, and I think maybe some of my colleagues from academia are potentially excited about, is the application space in science and the application space in national security, which will use large language models, but may also need physics-informed models, models that understand chemistry, biology, and math, that don't speak just language. And so that's what we're very excited about. We also talked a little bit about permitting in the last panel. One thing that we have been investing in is actually AI for permitting. We have a project called Voltaic with AI in the middle, where in fact we've taken the last 2 decades of NEPA data and tokenized it, made it AI ready and available, and released it to the community for academics and industry to build tools around. And so that's already out there in the world. We think that there's a huge amount of opportunity space for AI, both for permitting, but also AI to speed interconnection. So our Grid Deployment Office just recently announced a funding solicitation for solution sets in that space, because that's one of the big areas where there's a lot of energy pent up in the queue. So if we could speed up that process, that will get us that much closer to getting more energy onto the grid.
Oh, that's super interesting. And I'll get back to the voltaic program a bit later. David, how about you? You've done a lot of research on the energy transition. How does your research look like at the intersection of AI and the energy transition? What do you find?
Yeah, so thanks. So broadly, my research is about developing optimization algorithms for efficiently deploying resources in complex environments affected by uncertainty, and they're dynamically changing over time. And so many applications, and of course the energy sector has been sophisticated in embracing these tools for a long time. And some recent research, what we're trying to look at is really dynamic unit commitment planning. So thinking about tackling the duck curve and tackling energy intermittency of renewable resources. So there, really, if you think about an integrated system operator's planning problem, like think about a Duke Energy or Dominion, like a key challenge there is thinking about what is the system net load going to look like over the course of the next 12, 24 hours, right? And so you can think about this kind of in two steps. One, think about your predictive AI for predicting that system net load over the course of the day, and throw your fanciest, neural network-based model, whatever forecasting model you want to use. Now, as good as those models are getting, and a lot of that is about predicting weather uncertainty, kind of nowcasting that in the short term, there's still going to be uncertainty, and you're going to really get a cloud of scenarios that come from that, right? And so if you're a system operator, and that cloud, by the way, is going to get more and more diffuse as we think about more solar, more wind, more intermittent sources. What do you do as a system operator for planning there, right? And so current practice now is fairly sophisticated, but one thing you could do is just take the average of that big cloud, take the point forecast, plan around the average. And what we're arguing in this work is that's actually not the right way to do things. The right way to do things is to think about what could happen in every kind of state of the world, 6, 8, 10 hours down the road, and how do you want to be managing your hundreds, maybe thousands of resources smartly for all those different conditions. So kind of a full contingencies plan. So that's what we're looking at in this work. Very excited about it. So kind of giving a benchmark of efficiency gains. You could think right now, if you look at a system like a Duke Energy, for example, 2 to 3% lowering average costs while lowering risks. Potentially double or maybe even triple that, depending on how much solar and wind kind of increases over the next 10 years. And these are models, by the way, that you don't have to melt supercomputers, that you can actually run these on laptops. So that's the kind of work I've been doing and I'm particularly excited about.
Oh, that's very exciting, actually. And these are significant cost savings.
Yeah.
That's amazing. Himanshu, turning to you, I mean, your company is one of the few ones that are really in that space. What do you do at Climate AI? How do you leverage AI to tackle challenges posed by climate change?
Absolutely. So I think I'll go back to my earlier framework of AI actually helping increase effectiveness of climate solutions, and AI helping increase acting as a time multiplier, accelerating some of the climate solutions. So the time and effectiveness dimension, these are two frameworks. This is one framework we look at, and the effectiveness dimension is what David talked about, like increasing the reliability of renewable energy into the grid, and hence increasing the grid operations overall. I'll talk about the time dimension. And so we work with 30% of the seed industry. By seed industry, I mean the crop seed industry globally. Their biggest challenge, and currently the biggest challenge for farmers, is to get their hands onto climate resilient seeds as fast as they can. And one of the problems there is as these seed companies go on to launch these seeds, it takes them 10 to 12 years to launch these seeds. And by the time they launch seeds into the market, climate has already changed, and those seeds are already ineffective. So one of the problems that we observed in the entire process of this seed development, from like all the way from research to commercialization to the market, is the time it takes to trial multiple seeds. So as an example, if a company wants to launch drought-resistant cucumber seeds somewhere in India, then they will need to figure out locations where they can trial those drought-resistant seed varieties, either in India or somewhere on the nearby markets where they have right logistics and the right resources already available. So the earlier process used to be these companies sending out teams like of 3 or 4 people across multiple locations in India, globally. And these people will literally be camping for 2 or 3 years, collecting a lot of soil data, weather data, climate data, reporting it back to the headquarters, and spending at least $500,000 to $1 million per campsite. to be able to figure this out. What we said is like, if we can identify, in our case, what these companies do is they come to our platform and they say like, hey, I want to launch a drought-resistant cucumber seeds for this specific region in India. They just need to draw a circle on the map, and the algorithm automatically extracts the soil, the water characteristics, the climate characteristics that led to high yields, that will lead to high yields in that location, and matches it to a location nearby or globally. So reducing the time to conduct these trials to basically from 3 years to minutes, and cost from $500,000 to basically thousands of dollars. And then, as I mentioned, this platform is currently being used by 30% of the crop seed industry. So that's the another way of the time dimension I was talking about. How do we accelerate the solutions of climate change, especially in this case for improving resilience of farmers?
That's super interesting. I want to go back to Helena. Like you mentioned a really interesting program called Voltaic. And so you said you're developing this program at the UAE to help with permitting. Can you talk a bit more about this? Because I think we've done some work here at the center at Brookings, that one challenge with permitting is oftentimes the capacity, right? Like a lack of capacity at the local level, at the state level. People don't have the staff, people don't have the expertise. Is that where your program fits in? I'd love to hear more.
Yeah, I would actually take one step back from that. I mean, we have at DOE mobilized the entire department to make sure that we are addressing challenges related to this issue. Because remember, this is not just about rising data center energy needs. This is about electrification of the grid. This is about manufacturing coming back to the United States. So we're going to need to deal with this situation, whether or not it's about AI data centers. However, that's this first part of the curve. And so I think, across the department, whether it's looking at all of our loans, our tax incentives, our technical assistance that we can provide to localities to address the regionality of this issue, this is something that we're very, very focused on. So we've been convening many stakeholders from utilities to hyperscalers, data center developers, to really think about how we address this issue holistically. For AI and permitting, Voltaic is indeed focused on how we can use AI to potentially streamline the permitting process. We're working with the 13 agencies in the Permitting Council, signing MOUs, including with the CHIPS office, to potentially use this, which is still in beta testing mode. So right now we're really looking at, for example, when you look at a site, has there been a study in this area before? What has changed over time? What are easier ways that we can quickly get retrieve information from prior NEPA studies, which typically in the past would be a 200-page report that would go in a binder on the shelf. So how do we actually make that useful? I think a previous speaker spoke about even bigger challenges at state and local levels. And I think there's even more variation across states and localities in terms of different kinds of ordinances. For example, for charging stations or for wind turbines or other, we think that there's a lot of opportunity to potentially apply this to other areas. But this is going to be a program of work that we really develop further on later this year.
So that's super interesting. So do you plan down the line to also make this available to states and localities?
We hope so. We hope that this is going to be useful for a wide variety of stakeholders because we think this issue is not going away. We need to find a way to get more energy onto the grid as quickly as possible. Of course, it's only one piece of the entire puzzle, right? There's going to be interconnection. Of course, we're going to need to think about how we bring and address the regional nature of this challenge. Because as you know, it's not every part of the country that's experiencing this increase in data center demand. There are specific localities that really need some attention. One of the things that our secretary and the department has been very focused on is how we bring communities alongside. And the White House convened in September a number of federal agencies, a number of the big AI companies and utilities to really talk through this issue. And one of the things that folks at the Department of Energy have been looking at is looking at retired or retiring coal sites that could be used for redevelopment. So this is something that our Office of Policy has been leading on, but still, there's a lot of opportunities across the department and a lot of attention that's being placed on this very issue. I'm happy to send some resources afterwards to post because I think we just need to make that much more visible and much more well known.
David, back to you on the technical issues. When you look at the energy transition, what are some of the main challenges we face at the technical level?
Yeah, so I think some of the things that we're facing, you could break it down into sort of predictive challenges. And I'm going to focus my questions going to be, because there's lots of technical challenges related to finding alternative fuel sources, finding longer duration batteries, many, many other challenges, harvesting minerals more efficiently, recycling. I'm going to focus more on sort of the algorithmic challenges, if that's okay, and focus on energy systems. So I would break it down first thinking about sort of predictive challenges in terms of getting better models, really for predicting both weather and climate. And so this has been a huge area for AI, but there's still room for growing here. So part of the challenge, of course, is that there's this kind of, climate change is making predicting weather patterns more difficult. And so AI models have shown tremendous promise there for weather modeling, but predicting these extreme events that really aren't present in the data sets, that's just the fundamental limitation. So I think that's a challenge. I think there are certainly technical challenges related to just understanding the distributed nature of energy systems as we move towards virtual power plants, as we move towards the grid getting bigger and bigger. We've got something like 55,000 substations in the United States, and now we have challenges related to measuring power flows on every basically node of the network. We have smart meters, so there's just a tremendous data challenge there. And then I would also say kind of in between these things, like thinking about, also dispatch decisions, which I already talked about, kind of optimization decisions there, how you deploy the resources there in the short term and how you control those operations smartly, but also longer term capacity planning. Those are, resource allocation decisions that we have to think about longer term. And I think those are really challenging questions, like thinking about where we should be investing in expanding transmission line capacity. Thinking about a utility, should they be expanding solar or should they be expanding storage? And if so, what's the right mix there? When do we retire coal? We know we need to do it, but how quickly do we do it? Trading off, that could, in the short term, create other challenges, right? So I think those would be some of the big challenges. And then higher level, kind of maybe, again, kind of in between these things is sort of predicting human behavior is a huge challenge. And so can we use these tools to do things like demand response pricing more efficiently? And doing things like with vehicle-to-grid technologies, I think is really a big challenge we have right now. And also thinking about system operators and electricity markets and kind of their strategic behavior and day-ahead auctions and things like that. So I think those are kind of the big kind of technical challenges, kind of, again, broadly related to AI and energy systems that I would highlight. Yeah.
And would you say the US is kind of like ahead of the curve in like exploring these or solving some of those challenges, or are there other countries that are doing better than us?
So I think, I don't know that I have a great answer to that question. I can't say we're necessarily ahead on those things. I think if you look at weather forecasting models, I think the NOAA, has been doing that for a long time. But of course, the European models are used all the time, and I think we're seeing a lot of progress in that. I think part of it, of course, we're bottlenecked by policy implications and how things go in the U.S. And of course, we know that's a challenge, and there's lots of transition risk associated with that. I'm going to punt a little bit on that question, but I think there's a lot of opportunity for growth there.
Awesome. Himanshu, staying on the technical aspect, what's the technology that is underpinning climate AI, and how is it different from previous technologies that have been used for analytics, for risk modeling?
Sure. And before that, can I take a step back and I think highlight the importance of the project that Helena talked about. And of course, Helena and I were there as a co-speaker at an MIT AI conference as well. So when I was in the government of India and we were preparing the National Solar Plan, this was in 2013 and 14, and we called up the meetings of all the key developers in the government, along with the major corporations in US, in India, and of course the foreign corporations in the US, wanting to get into the renewable energy boom in India. The number one concern all of them highlighted was the permitting for their projects in India as well. So I'm very excited about that, the project that Helena is leading at DOE, and it shows progress. It has a lot of global applicability as well in accelerating deployment of renewable energy into the grid. So back to the technical challenges that you talked about, Sanjay. We also look at like AI and climate problem as both a big data as well as a lack of data problem, right? Yes, of course, we all understand there's a lot of data coming from satellite sensors, from radar stations, from weather stations, and so on and so forth. And can the machine learning models crunch these numbers I think as David talked about, in a physics-driven AI way to create inferences which were not possible before using the deep learning models or transformer models today. Yes, that's one aspect. But I also want to highlight the other aspect is the lack of data problem. If you look at California versus Alabama, California has spent literally hundreds of millions of dollars into creating a great weather station infrastructure, radar station infrastructure inside the state, and also spent millions of dollars into create a high resolution weather forecasting infrastructure model local to California. So there's a federal model for weather forecasting produced by NOAA or National Weather Service. And there are these high resolution, which is low resolution, and there's high resolution model produced by California. But then what we realized is that as you are trying to explore our work outside of US and let's say in Africa and India is not all these countries have invested that much money into creating that high density weather infrastructure to be able for these machine learning models to do well in terms of forecasting. So one of the approaches that we apply, say like, hey, can we use the deep fake technology as we all know, which is used to create, we are nothing but generative models that are used to create fake videos or fake images, which looks as good as a real image. So can we use the same approach to create a fake image of a high resolution precipitation forecast, especially extreme precipitation forecast, learning from the weather station in learning from the weather models in California, and see if this works in Alabama. And to our surprise, what we realize is that model creates forecast which is as good as if Alabama were to create its own weather forecasting model, right? So for us, there was a lack of data problem that AI was able to solve in this case. And we realized that if this is successful in Alabama, now how do we translate that to other countries like Africa, where they have not invested, or frankly, they don't have hundreds of millions of dollars to invest in high density weather infrastructure and weather forecasting models. So for us, of course, as you talked about, Sanjay, one is can we use AI to crunch this big data problem in a physics-driven machine learning way? I can talk about that later. And the second is, can we use AI to go around this lack of data problem that we see in some of the forecasting applications, not just weather forecasting, but also translating its impact into specific metrics that businesses and governments care about.
Great. I mean, that's a really important and interesting angle, because oftentimes, as you say, in those countries and areas of the world where we have the biggest impacts of climate change, we don't have the resources to necessarily deal with it and adapt to it. Helena, I want to talk a little bit about something that came up in the previous panel. And it's also very striking. Whenever you talk to tech leaders on the West Coast, they always talk about abundance, and an age of abundance that AI is going to usher in for all of us. One of these aspects is we need abundant energy to do so, right? And so what role do you see for AI to actually help provide cheap, clean, and abundant energy? Because there are no silver bullets, right? And so I think oftentimes there's a bit of wishful thinking when we look at kind of like how can we meet all our demands for energy in the next couple of decades.
Yeah, and I think if you're looking at this issue, you're not thinking in terms of decades. You're thinking about what does the next 5 years look like, and that's a very short timeline in energy speak. So we have been doing a lot of thinking around what we can do in the short term, things like grid enhancing technologies, reconductoring, finding ways to develop new kinds of clean tariffs to incentivize more energy coming up, but don't require the long lead times that permitting might require. But also looking at the newer technologies that are going to be needed. DOE has put out a series of reports, Pathways to Commercial Liftoff. We've also put out a resource adequacy report that's looking at the energy demand and the things that are going to be needed to meet that energy demand. Our Office of Cybersecurity, Energy Security, and Emergency Response have been very, very engaged with the energy sector to look at the potential benefits and the risks that AI can pose to the grid, because these data centers are large loads that can be used, and they can be used maliciously. So we really need to make sure that the lights stay on, that this critical infrastructure that powers so much other critical infrastructure is maintained. So all of these things are key focus areas for the department right now. But abundance, we are very excited about the opportunity for AI for energy. And in fact, our national labs earlier this year put out a report that looks at the potential application space, from subsurface monitoring, discovery of new critical materials. We actually, one of our national labs, Pacific Northwest National Lab, developed a partnership with Microsoft to look at the universe of possible materials, and then narrowed it down in a matter of weeks to develop a new type of battery that uses 70% less lithium, which is tremendous, and then fabricated and tested it. So I think the key thing is not so much is the battery in production, because this is still in the sort of basic science stage, but it's about speed to discovery. And I think that speed to discovery relates to more broader scientific breakthroughs, but also to the energy sector writ large.
And so DOE also funds research and supports research, right? What role do you see for DOE kind of like in funding innovation in AI, not necessarily in energy, but in AI applications?
Yeah. And we do fund research in AI. In fact, DOE has a very large part of the budget in our Office of Science that maintains, they do a lot of investment in basic science. But I think one really good example to point to is how we got to these 3 fastest supercomputers that I talked about a little bit earlier. Because 10 years ago, the road to getting to this exascale level of computer was primarily an energy efficiency problem. We could not figure out how to develop computers that were big enough and fast enough and still afford to maintain them. And so at the time, 10 years ago, what DOE did was not look at what was technically possible. DOE set a target of what we were willing to pay for the energy of the life of the supercomputer, and then divided it by 5, which is generally the life of the supercomputer. And that's how we got our energy target. And it was in deep partnership with companies like NVIDIA, with Intel, with HPE, AMD, that we were able to develop these fastest supercomputers in the world, which also had the co-benefit of developing key components of today's GPUs. So I think that's a really good example of the kind of role that public investment in public-private partnerships can make to really change the game. We would have gotten to this stage of energy growth so much faster if we had not been able to drive the energy efficiency gains in computing to begin with. And we think that there is a whole universe of energy efficiency in algorithms that we are also investing in right now.
And does DOE, going back a little bit to the question that I asked David earlier, do you guys exchange information, best practices with other governments around the world?
Oh, yes, absolutely. I mean, we have very robust international collaborations. One thing I would also flag is that our Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory has a congressionally mandated data center energy efficiency report that comes out every few years. The next instantiation, which is probably going to be the most widely read report, is actually coming out later this month. So just wanted to flag for the group. We're really excited about it.
For us to look forward to.
Yes.
David, when you look at kind of like improving energy systems and using AI for that, what kind of algorithms and techniques are we talking here about? And how is that different from the large language models that we all know with ChatGPT, or the conventional algorithms that we've seen before?
Yeah, so I love this question because it really gets me to nerd out a little bit. So first, step back a little bit. What is a large language model? It's kind of mystical now. It's this powerful, just nebulous thing. We just type something and magically something appears. There's tremendous engineering and sophistication there, but at its core, it is a class probability estimation model. It's a large neural network. Given a sequence of words, give me a probability distribution on the next word in that sequence. So it's a classification algorithm, essentially. So what's one similarity I see in a lot of what AI is doing in energy systems? A lot of the best predictive models are based on neural networks. So the underlying kind of architecture and machinery is kind of using similar tools. I would say kind of some differences, however. If we look at large language models, what we're typically thinking about is language data, right, which is unstructured. A lot of the data in energy systems is much more structured, just looking at system loads, demands for electricity, PV production, whatnot. Now, there are exceptions, and one exception it was alluded to was satellite imagery, and that's come up in a few different panels. We're seeing a lot of algorithms based on, using convolutional neural networks to basically process image data and measure things like greenhouse gas emissions. So we've got an organization, Climate Trace. We've got Kyle Bradbury at Duke, at Nicholas Institute, who's also been a big part of that, basically looking at predictive techniques for that, satellite imagery data. But then there's one other thing that's kind of an interesting twist here is that what we're hearing we heard this in the previous panel, is the large language models, the load growth explosion, all the energy we need. Actually, it's the opposite when you look at AI tools in some sense for building for models that are coming out there, is that they're kind of actually getting around all the energy usage of the more traditional models, like the physics-based models, which if you think about simulating a century, that can take something like 10 megawatt hours, and it can take weeks to simulate on supercomputers. Now, with AI-based models, actually, we can do that much, much faster, millions of times faster. And so that's kind of an interesting parallel to everything that's going on with large language models, and that's hopefully a comforting thing, thinking about energy consumption. And the flip side of that that's really interesting, and this is a parallel with, I think, everything we're seeing with large language models, is the open source paradigm. Is because now these models are being developed and they can be run on someone's laptop, for example, whereas before only the NOAA or something on their supercomputers could be running these. We're seeing kind of an opening of doors here to open source models where you can have many, much smaller organizations and even individuals, academic researchers running these kinds of models, and there's a huge, potentially positive spillovers there. So I think that's kind of, how I would think about that, yeah.
That's a very interesting angle that you bring up here. The open source debate is a big one in the AI community, as we all know, because of national security concerns, and there are different camps among the tech firms. Helena, how do you think about that, the open source? What does the DOE look like? Because the DOE is also concerned with national security, with protecting our secrets. What do you guys look at when you look at open source?
So, DOE is an R&D agency that is really uniquely situated in the federal family because we are a science and technology agency, but we do span from open science through national security applications. Obviously, we support open source technology, our Office of Science. We have a lot of things that we have made open source, and many federal agencies are all working on open science. We have directives there, but we also see some potential risks from data that may be particularly sensitive, and so we have been looking at what we need to potentially be able to do. We've been evaluating open source models as well as proprietary models. Our National Nuclear Security Administration, in fact, for the last year has been looking at what these models may mean in terms of nuclear threat information and their ability to collate information from all across the internet, and whether or not that changes the threat environment. So that's something that we have been actively looking at for some time.
That's a difficult balance to strike, right?
Yeah.
I would imagine. Himanshu, I want to take a step back and so you're commented from the private sector, right? What role do you see for the private sector to help solve the climate crisis, and what support do you think would be most useful from policymakers and from the government?
I think number one is going back to Alina's point. Just let it be all open source for now. Of course, there are applications like nuclear and national security applications where one could think about developing proprietary models, which are procured by DoD or whoever else. But look at it this way: we all take a lot of pride in how the societal transformation mobile phones have been able to bring in emerging economies. We have big examples of India, Thailand, even now in Africa, right? Where people getting digitally connected is bringing societies along, transforming societies. Now imagine if Android was not an open source operating system. Would we have seen such a proliferation of smartphones in the developing world if we were still relying on iOS? That's something to think about, right? So I think of compute applications as basically it's it should be a public utility, and as is electricity, for developers to come in and start building applications on top. And that's where I feel like we are spend too much time on debating between open source versus proprietary. I don't think we are at a stage where we have seen enough proliferation of AI and enough people getting connected, like enough developers globally getting connected. So as an example, even if you look at ERP systems of 2000s, right? ERP, I'm talking about Oracle and NetSuite, the CRM systems that they built in early 2000s. What has been the penetration of those systems in the enterprise world? Any guesses? These systems came up during the dot-com boom, late 90s and early 2000s. It's less than 40%. Less than 40%, right? So some of the companies that we also work with, like in manufacturing, in agriculture, they are still operating on Excel sheets versus operating on some CRMs and whatnot, right? And so that's so I feel like as an entrepreneur in AI myself, I think there's we should focus a lot more on basically helping developers build applications on top of inference models on top of these open source models and not have any regulations come up, except for a few applications like in nuclear and national security applications where I think DoD or whichever government can procure proprietary models from existing vendors. So that's one. And my apologies, Sanjay, I forgot the later part of your question. And maybe like in the interest of time, feel free to move on.
Okay, no problem. Maybe David, like you can chime in on this. When we look at policy incentives, right, in making supply decisions, what kind of like role should policymakers play, and how do you see the incentives from the IRA? Are those effective in actually incentivizing supply and the supply we need?
Yeah, so I think policy is essential. We're not going to get there if we talk about net zero with just technological solutions, because there are so many different forefronts. It's not just making utilities operate more efficiently. There's also agriculture and the transportation sector, making all the production processes more efficient. I think the Inflation Reduction Act has been beneficial. I don't think anyone, even the drafters of that, the intent was that was going to fix everything. Really, that was a stimulus to get private capital. Has it done enough in that regard? I think the jury's still out on that, but I think it's a step in the right direction. I think there are things like fundamental valuation questions that policy can help with. Coming back to grid, expansion. We're looking at maybe $25 trillion of expansion of the U.S. electricity grid by 2050. How do we think about, that when we're thinking about, trading off that versus expanding transmission line capacity versus microgrids? And how do we think about valuing that when you're talking about, local regions that are connected to, hospitals and schools and things like that? How do we make those wrestle with those valuation questions? That's where policy should really be making a difference. And so, I do think, if you look again, coming back to utilities, I think, we have a FERC expert on the previous panel, but, if you look at FERC 1920, that's really forcing, balancing authorities to think longer term in their capacity planning. I think that's something that's really good. And so hopefully that will help. I think the silver lining of all this, kind of the huge economic value from AI, just coming back maybe to the previous panel, is I think this gives us strong economic incentives to kind of hopefully expand renewable capacity. I think policy is going to be essential in kind of buoying that.
Moving it along, Richard. Great. Helena, two questions that kind of like, one related to the audience and one also on the role of policymakers. I think oftentimes the concern is when we look at government and the tech industry to attract the right talent in government, in AI especially, because AI obviously pays a lot in the private sector, and this usually the government cannot keep up with that. How do you view this at DOE to attract the right talent to actually keep up on the market trends? And then this relates to someone in the audience. How do you see kind of the next administration, kind of like what kind of changes do you expect or not expect to happen?
So I think on the first question around workforce and talent, this is something that obviously DOE is dealing with. I'm sure many institutions are dealing with, because we cannot pay the salaries that the big AI companies can pay. But I think for DOE, if people come to DOE for many reasons, pay is one of them, but I mean, the key has been the mission. And so we have over 40,000 scientists at our national laboratories, chemists, biologists, physicists, who are really committed to doing science for the public good. And I think what is helpful is that we have other things to play with or use, like the infrastructure that I was talking about. Some folks come to DOE because of the very unique laser that we have, or the supercomputers that they get to use. And I think that's an important part, right? It's the unique facilities attract talent, but I think public investment and continued investment in that kind of infrastructure and in the kind of capability agency that DOE is going to be important moving forward. I can't opine on what the next administration will do, but I think, again, just going back to what DOE is as an agency, we really are an enabling agency for many other parts of the U.S. government, some that you may not be so aware of, right? Whether it's helping to model the Mars rover landing, or working with VA on veterans' health, or climate modeling with NOAA. These are capabilities that DOE nurtures at DOE and the national laboratories for the country. And I think moving forward, we are going to need to find new and novel ways to partner more aggressively than before with academic institutions and with industry, because I think the only way that we continue to maintain our leadership in AI is to be able to do that.
No, that's a great point. We're almost at the end, so very briefly, each one of you, a brief kind of like key takeaway that you want the audience to go home with today. Himanshu, let's start with you. Main key takeaway.
Sure. My key takeaway is like I'm a former climate policy maker. From that standpoint, I feel very pessimistic about from 2014 to now. Forget any reduction in emissions. We have not seen even the reduction in pace of emissions since Paris Climate Accord, where I was deeply involved in modeling emissions for India. But as an entrepreneur, I feel very optimistic as well in the role of AI. Come to think of it, when the pandemic started in 2020, we went from having no knowledge of the COVID virus, like literally no knowledge of COVID virus, to deploying 5 billion vaccines globally within 18 months. Why can't we do the same for some of these climate problems that we are seeing? What is not working, and that's something that we need to think about. It's definitely not technology. It's definitely not funding. There is some funding available. Of course, we can always see like how can we deploy more funding towards AI applied to climate. There's a lot of funding coming in AI already. There's something else, and that's for. I always think about that, and for all of us to think about what is not working here. We have solved ozone hole problem. Why are we so delayed in solving the climate problem?
Great, thank you. David.
Yeah, so I guess a couple things really quickly. So first, I would say not to dismiss the need for regulations and the ethical concerns. I think we should not be afraid of AI. I think we should embrace it as something that could be a force for good. And then kind of coming back to that point, I would say thinking about education, and I would say even earlier than higher education, thinking about the Duke Universities of the world, we're going to be facing a tremendous talent shortage in the energy sector. We have roughly 500,000 employees. A lot of that is in oil and gas, but we've got an aging workforce that's going to be retiring over the next decade or so. And that's a huge opportunity with these new technologies to do something great. And so I would start education, kind of think about primary school education and get kids in this country excited about these technologies. And I say this as a father of 2 boys. My 10-year-old son refers to me as net zero bro. So I say that. So thinking about policymakers and investments, I think investing in education and these tools is really important.
I love that point. That's a very unique approach to it. Helena.
I think that we're really excited. I think this moment, both in terms of what AI can do for energy and the grid broadly, And the opportunity space, I mean, I want to go back to the abundance point earlier, really to use this moment to catalyze energy for AI, not only for AI, but also for manufacturing in the States and broader electrification goals. I think we're really at that cusp where we need to address both of these and need to do it at scale. And we're really just happy to be here and part of this conversation as it moves forward.
Great. Thank you so much for the outstanding panel, for your viewpoint. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And we now have Ronnie Chatterjee from Duke and OpenAI for the closing remarks. Please, Ronnie, over to you.
Thank you. Well, I have the pleasant honor to just thank everybody here. Let's see here. Can you hear me okay? I have the opportunity now and the honor to just thank all the panelists and the fantastic collaboration between Duke and Brookings. I'm Ronnie Chatterjee at Duke University, speaking in that capacity today, since this was organized way before all this happened to me. But the reason we put this together is to kind of highlight what you saw today, the opportunities and the challenges. And the two panels somewhat seemed oppositional at the beginning when you saw one talking about the challenges and the others with the opportunities. But at the end of the day, I think you saw optimism on both panels, both in terms of trying to solve some of these challenges. And ironically, and Helena's remarks were relevant to this, some of the opportunities and challenges are commingled. So if you think about NEPA, for example, this point about, that Zach brought up many times about NEPA and reform of NEPA being tied to now this project to tokenize NEPA, to give that as an open source model to people to play around with it and figure out where it can be improved. And so I think you're going to see a lot of this duality throughout these topics as we go forward. The reason we wanted to bring Duke and Brookings together is because we don't think that one institution can solve this on its own. And so it took a collaboration like this to have a diverse set of panelists and perspectives. I also think it was notable that we had folks from the regulatory side, business, and academia coming together. It was somewhat daunting during some of these discussions to think about how many innovations have to happen simultaneously across how many different sectors. I was counting the hardware and software piece, designing better chips, better data centers, thinking about sort of connecting all of that to the grid, new sources of energy from small modular reactors to bringing more wind, solar, and storage online. And then I thought about even the innovations in finance that Mark Florian from BlackRock talked about. Private credit has been booming recently and is one of the biggest funders and financiers of these exact infrastructure projects. So if you think about that, even short of all the government innovation that needs to come into play, yes, the federal government, but often, as was emphasized on the first panel, state and local government as well. When you put all that together, you might come away thinking, oh my gosh, how are we going to do all this? But I think that the innovation entrepreneurship spirit that was embodied in the last panel and throughout, it's not going to be one lever that's going to be pulled here, right? There's going to be a bunch of institutions working on this, maybe sometimes in an uncoordinated fashion. And I want to say just three things at the end to wrap us up and then close us out. One is flexibility is really important. One of the things I did in my most recent role in government was implement the CHIPS and Science Act. And I was also alongside the implementation of the Inflation Reduction Act. Now, I can tell you the words AI didn't come into the CHIPS Act and the IRA until much, much later. We designed the CHIPS Act to solve a problem about onshoring domestic chip production, not to win the race for AI, but to make sure that we could have computer chips for our phones, right, for our medical devices, for the grid. Now the conversation about chips is all about AI. When we talked about the incentives for the Inflation Reduction Act, we were thinking about climate change, fulfilling some of the promise that Himanshu talked about that he worked on in India. We weren't talking about the energy use of AI, which has now become a dominant issue and a reason that we're talking about the Inflation Reduction Act today. So that flexibility, maintaining that's going to be really important. We had a lot of solutions today, but I'm sure there's lots of things we haven't even thought about because we're not even asking the right questions. We're going to have to keep following that. Second thing is the geopolitical dimension. I think probably if we do another version of this, we should do something on the rest of the world. This was very U.S. focused by design. But one thing I'll say about sort of the competition here in the AI infrastructure space is other countries are having these same discussions, some with some of the same permitting challenges that you see in the United States, some without those challenges, right? And different sets of challenges. Where is the AI infrastructure to power this new generation of technologies going to be built out? And the US now has both the national challenge of doing it here, but also a global challenge related to climate change. That's going to be something interesting to watch. I think we should focus on in the future. Lastly, I want to say we're going to keep doing events on these kind of topics, both here at Brookings and also at Duke. In April at Duke, we'll have our second annual Billions to Trillions conference, which talks about how to unlock climate finance for exactly these kinds of solutions. And looking forward, we'll do more projects around deep technologies at Duke, both quantum, synthetic biology, generative AI, and of course, coming back to advanced microprocessors and computer chips. For now, I just want to thank the panelists for both their breadth of experience, but also the depth of their responses. It was really great to see this expertise out here. I also want to thank the audience for your questions and engagement. Thanks, everyone, for being here, and we'll see you at the next event.